What if you woke up tomorrow and the word front line meant nothing to you? Not because the news finally had a slow day, but because no army has crossed a border on this continent in over 3,000 years. What if every single war you've ever heard of, the ones that build nations and the ones that erase them, the ones in your textbooks and the ones in this morning's headlines, simply never happened? Not Waterloo, not Verdun, not Stalingrad, not the war that is still being fought in Ukraine as I say this sentence. None of it. Here's the thing people get wrong when they try to imagine a peaceful Europe. They picture it starting in 1945, some United Nations fantasy, where the great powers finally sit down and behave themselves after 2 world wars burn the continent down twice in 30 years. That's not what we're doing today. We're going back further than that, further than the Crusades, further than Rome, further than anything with a name you'd recognize. We're going back to the actual beginning of organized violence on this continent and asking what happens if it never gets going in the first place. So, quick history refresher, because the starting point matters more than people think. Warfare as an idea is older than Europe's written record by a long way. The earliest documented war anywhere in human history comes out of Sumer in Mesopotamia, sometime around 2450 BC, a border conflict between the city-states of Lagash and Umma that got carved onto a limestone slab we now call the Stele of the Vultures. It shows a king named Ianitum leading a phalanx of Lagash spearmen over the corpses of Umma's soldiers, while actual vultures carry off the heads. That's not symbolism, that's a receipt. Humans were writing down the fact that they killed each other over land 2,500 years before Rome was even a rumor. But Europe has its own receipt, and it's almost as old, and it's a lot less well known. In the Tollense Valley, in what's now northern Germany, archaeologists have spent the last 3 decades pulling bronze arrowheads, flint points, wooden clubs, and human bone out of a slow-moving river. Somewhere around 1250 BC, 2 forces met along that riverbank, something like 3,000 to 5,000 men in total, and by the time it was over, at least 750 of them were dead, some cut down by arrows, some crushed by maces, some ridden down by warriors on horseback. Researchers now call it the oldest archaeologically verifiable battlefield on the entire continent. Bronze Age Europe, it turns out, was already capable of fielding armies the size of small towns and marching them at each other with real tactics and real command structure, more than 1,000 years before anyone had heard of Julius Caesar. So that's our hinge, not a treaty, not a diplomat. A ridge above a river in Bronze Age Germany on a day we can't even pin to the year when the first army this continent ever produced walked out to meet another army, and both sides decided whatever they were fighting over was worth dying for. What if they didn't? What if, for reasons we will never fully explain and honestly aren't going to try to, that particular argument gets settled some other way, and so does every single one after it forever? I want to be upfront about what kind of video this is. This isn't a what if they all just got along fantasy where I hand-wave some UN summit into the Bronze Age. It's a rule we're applying to the timeline and then following wherever the consequences actually lead, the same way historians study the actual past. No European power, from that riverbank in Germany all the way to this afternoon, ever wages war again. Not against each other, not overseas, not once. Sit with how enormous that rule actually is, because almost nothing about the world you're currently living in survives contact with it. But let's not skip straight to Rome, because there's an entire civilization sitting between the Tollense riverbank and the Roman Republic that gets erased just as completely, and it's the one most people think of first when they picture the ancient world. Classical Greece, as you know it, is a society built by war and for war. When the Persian Empire invades in 490 BC and again in 480 BC, it's the battles at Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis that get remembered as the moment a scattering of quarreling city-states decided fighting back was worth the cost, and the wealth, confidence, and citizen navy that came out of winning is what historically funds the Parthenon, fills Pericles' Athens with philosophers and playwrights, and hands the poorer rowers who crewed the fleet at Salamis enough political leverage to push Athenian democracy towards something genuinely radical. Take the war out, and Athens doesn't have that leverage to give away. Persia's empire simply absorbs the Greek world without a fight, the way it already held Ionia, Egypt, and half of Central Asia. No marathon runner, no Spartan last stand, no golden age funded by victory, and a full century later, no Alexander the Great either, because Alexander's entire biography is a military campaign from Macedon to India. No Hellenistic kingdoms, scattering Greek language, art, and philosophy from Alexandria to the edge of the Himalayas. Whatever Greek civilization survives inside a peaceful Persian province, it isn't the one your history teacher showed you on a slideshow. Start with Rome, because Rome is the first domino after that, and it falls immediately. The Roman Republic doesn't become an empire by asking nicely. It becomes an empire by conquering Gaul under Caesar, crushing Carthage across 3 Punic Wars, absorbing Iberia, Britain, Greece, and the entire Mediterranean coastline through 5 straight centuries of military campaigning. Strip out the wars, and you strip out the empire. What you're left with is a mid-sized Italian city-state, maybe a regional trading power at best, never controlling territory from Scotland to the Sahara. No legions building roads across 3 continents. No forced spread of Latin into every corner of Western Europe, which means no Romance language family as we know it. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, all of them exist historically because Roman soldiers imposed Latin on conquered populations who eventually forgot their own tongues. Take away the conquest, and Europe stays roughly as linguistically fractured as it was in the Bronze Age. Dozens of unrelated tongues clustered a valley apart from each other, closer to the patchwork you still find in the Caucasus today than to the tidy handful of language families we actually ended up with. And because there's no imperial collapse, there's no fall of Rome either, because there was never a Rome large enough to fall. No barbarian invasions, because there's no empire to invade, and no war-hardened confederations of Goths and Vandals and Franks built by generations of fighting Roman legions and each other. Whatever migrations happen across this period still happen. People have always moved, but they move without the military machinery that historically turned migration into conquest, which means the Franks don't carve out Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons don't carve out Britain. The entire founding myth of nearly every Western European kingdom, a warrior people arriving somewhere and taking it by force, simply isn't available as a story anymore because nobody's taking anything by force anywhere, ever. Push forward into the Middle Ages, and the casualties keep stacking up, and I mean that almost literally in reverse. There's no Norman conquest because there's no Norman warrior aristocracy built out of 2 centuries of Viking raiding and French feudal warfare to produce a William who thinks invading England is a reasonable career move. There's no Crusades, no 200-year military campaign to seize Jerusalem, which also means no centuries of escalating hostility, hardening the boundary between the Christian and Islamic worlds the way those wars historically did. There's no 100 Years' War between England and France, no Wars of the Roses, no 30 Years' War tearing a third of the population out of Central Europe over religion. And there's no Reconquista in Iberia, which is a bigger deal than it sounds like, because that 700-year military campaign to push Muslim rule out of Spain and Portugal is the direct training ground for the conquistadors who later crossed the Atlantic. Take the wars out, and Al-Andalus, the Muslim civilization of Iberia, doesn't get militarily dismantled. You could genuinely be looking at a Spain and Portugal that remain religiously and culturally mixed, Christian and Muslim, for centuries longer than they actually did, maybe indefinitely. Picture what it would actually feel like to walk across this version of Europe, because I think the maps undersell it. You wouldn't cross borders the way you do now, a checkpoint every few hundred kilometers. You'd cross them every few miles, the way you still technically could in the old Holy Roman Empire, where a single day's travel might carry you through the territory of a free city, a prince-bishopric, a minor duchy, and a self-governing valley league, each with its own coinage, its own laws, its own dialect, barely intelligible to its neighbor, one ridge over. There's no France in the sense of one language, one flag, one army, one capital, because the specific wars that hammered a few hundred squabbling counties and duchies into a small number of large, centralized kingdoms never happened. There's no national anthem because there's no nation large enough to need one. What there is instead is something closer to what Germany and Italy both actually looked like right up until the 1860s, except it never ends, because nothing ever comes along with the brutal unifying efficiency of war to force it to end. Here's where it gets structurally interesting, because the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the treaty that ended the 30 Years' War, is the document historians point to as the birth of the modern nation-state, fixed borders, recognized sovereignty, the whole architecture of the international system you're currently living inside. That treaty exists because a catastrophic war made European rulers desperate enough to formalize the rules. Remove the war and you remove the reason anyone bothered inventing modern sovereignty in the first place. Europe doesn't necessarily consolidate into the 60 or so countries you'd recognize on a map today. It has a real shot at staying something closer to what the Holy Roman Empire actually was for most of its history, a patchwork of several hundred overlapping kingdoms, prince-bishoprics, free cities, and feudal estates, because nothing ever came along with the brutal efficiency of war to force them into fewer, bigger units. Now here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because it flips the entire premise of this video on its head. Colonization, the European conquest of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, the carving up of Africa and Asia, all of that runs on a military technology base that was refined almost entirely through centuries of European wars fighting each other. Gunpowder weapons get faster, more accurate, and more lethal generation after generation, specifically because European powers keep testing them against each other on European soil. Naval warfare, siege engineering, standing professional armies, all of it is a byproduct of non-stop internal conflict. A Europe that never fights a war doesn't have that arms race, which means it very plausibly never develops the specific military edge that let a few hundred Spanish soldiers topple the Aztec and Inca empires, or that let a handful of European trading companies eventually carve up entire continents. Cortés doesn't have centuries of Reconquista-honed steel and tactics behind him. There's a real argument that the Americas, Africa, and large parts of Asia are never colonized by Europe at all, not because Europeans became more ethical, but because they never built the specific killing machine that made it possible. Which means you have to ask what fills that vacuum, because a world without European colonization doesn't sit empty. Ming and Qing China, the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire, all of them were, at various points, wealthier, more populous, and more technologically sophisticated than Europe was for most of this period. Without a war-forged Europe muscling onto the world stage with cannons and colonies, the center of global power plausibly stays where it had been for most of human history, in Asia and the Middle East, instead of swinging violently toward London, Madrid, and Paris for 400 years. There is no United States as you know it because there's no English, French, and Spanish colonization to produce it. There's no transatlantic slave trade in this specific form it historically took, an enterprise that required naval power and colonial military occupation to run at that scale for that long. And think about what that means on the other side of the ocean, because we almost never do. The Aztec Empire doesn't fall to Cortés in 1521. The Inca Empire doesn't fall to Pizarro a decade later. Whatever contact eventually happens between the Americas and the rest of the world, it isn't 300 armored men and a few cannons walking into Tenochtitlan and toppling a civilization of 250,000 people through a combination of steel, disease, and local alliances built on generations of Aztec conquest warfare that Cortés simply plugged himself into. Without that specific chain of European and Mesoamerican war-making colliding at exactly the wrong moment, indigenous civilizations across the Americas plausibly keep developing on their own terms for centuries longer than they got in our timeline, maybe indefinitely. That's not a minor footnote to this hypothetical. That's tens of millions of people and an entire hemisphere's worth of independent history that our actual timeline simply doesn't have. Let's talk about the price tag, because I think it's the thing people underestimate the most. Wars didn't just take land, they built almost everything else too. The push toward better metallurgy, ballistics, and engineering that eventually gives you the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution has deep roots in centuries of military competition between European states desperate to outarm each other. Modern nationalism, the idea that you are fundamentally German or French or Italian rather than just a resident of your particular valley, gets forged largely in the shared trauma and shared glory of war. The Napoleonic campaigns that first made ordinary Frenchmen think of themselves as French, the wars of unification that welded 350 separate German states into a single country under Prussian leadership in 1871, the equivalent wars that did the same for a patchwork Italian peninsula in the 1860s. No war means no unification campaigns, which means Germany and Italy very plausibly never become single countries at all. They stay what they were before those wars, a scattering of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states permanently. And then there's the 20th century, which is where this hypothetical gets almost impossible to hold in your head all at once, because so much of what defines the modern world came directly out of the two most destructive wars in human history. No First World War means no collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, German, and Russian empires, which means the multi-ethnic map of Central Europe and the Middle East never gets redrawn along the lines that are still causing conflict today. No Second World War means, and I want to say this plainly because it matters more than any other consequence on this list, no Holocaust. 6 million Jewish people and millions of others murdered in the Nazi genocide simply do not die, because the regime and the war that enabled that genocide never happens. That's not a footnote in this hypothetical. If nothing else survives from everything I've said today, let that one. And because there's no First World War, there's no Ottoman collapse either, no British and French diplomats drawing straight lines across the desert with no regard for who actually lived there, no Sykes-Picot Agreement inventing the borders of Iraq and Syria in a room in London. The Ottoman Empire, or whatever it evolves into without the war that broke it, plausibly still governs a version of the Middle East, recognizably descended from itself instead of a set of post-colonial states drawn by outsiders who left a century of conflict behind on their way out the door.